From WNPR, I'm John Dankosky, and this is The Wheelhouse.
All right, snowfall totals, as I said, ranged from 2 inches to nearly 2 feet.
New information about the House Republican bill to repeal and replace Obamacare. It's just been made public.
I think there's pretty sound evidence that the microwave is not a sound way of surveilling someone, and I think that has been cleaned up. It was made in jest, so.
I'm proud to welcome everyone to our first official cabinet meeting.
What I have here is a copy of Donald Trump's tax returns. We have his federal tax return for 1 year for 2005. I believe this is the only set of the president's federal taxes that reporters have ever gotten a hold of.
And eventually we'll hear what's in those tax returns. You can join this conversation about the week's news, 860-275-7266. Comment on our website, wnpr.org/The Wheelhouse. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at WNPR Wheelhouse. A lot to get to. With, as always, Colin McEnroe, host of the Colin McEnroe Show on WNPR. Hi there, Colin.
Good morning, Mr. Dankosky.
Also joining us is Matt Kaufman, investigative reporter at the Hartford Courant. Thanks for joining us, Matt.
Happy to be here.
And Christine Stewart is here. She's editor-in-chief at ctnewsjunkie.com. Hello, Christine.
Good morning, John.
Let's start, actually, with that big snowstorm we had yesterday. Governor Dan Malloy back in his element, shepherding the state through a big winter storm that dumped, well, more than 20 inches at my house in Winstead, and a nasty mixture of ice and rain in a lot of the rest of the state. Malloy instituted a travel ban yesterday, told people to stay home and bake brownies. And it looks like, well, the state's up and running again today. We're pretty good at this by this point, Colin.
I think we are, and governors, of course, famously in this state, in particular, are judged by how well they handle situations like this. El Grasso became impervious by doing such a good job. Other governors, like Tom Meskel and Lowell Weicker, have run into trouble by not being around when they're supposed to be around. And I do think Malloy's decision, I mean, having lived through 2001 where they didn't get the cars off the highways fast enough, I was on WTIC at the time. I stayed on the air until 9 o'clock just talking to people who were up on the highway not moving, and they'd sort of eaten all the dusty Tic Tacs they could find, down on the floor mats, and now they were like looking at their fingers and thinking, well, do I need all my fingers? So, I mean, you want to avoid that situation, and I think he pretty well did yesterday.
Yeah, and I think that's what actually works whenever the travel ban goes into effect. Everyone stays off the state roads, Matt, and then, the next day it's pretty well cleaned up. You can get back to business as usual. Yes, this governor has had an awful lot of experience with big storms like this, but it's something that I feel as though he's gotten pretty good at and the state has gotten pretty used to.
Yeah, and I think you're right that he's sort of in his element on these things. I think it's this is not an intractable issue like the state budget and the like. I mean, there is a process. We have, for some reason, we all know there are exactly 604 plows or however many there are out there. And I think he probably enjoys that opportunity to go to the Emergency Operations Center, have, a very defined thing. Everyone is on the same page. This is not a partisan issue. And I don't know, it's probably kind of a respite if you're the governor of a state with all sorts of issues.
I have PTSD when we talk about the Emergency Operations Center because I spent so much time there back in 2011. But I think that, the state has obviously gotten better at this. It did fall in the middle of the week. So there was that inconvenience, but, we got it cleaned up and we're back to business.
I think the only thing really a little bit different yesterday's a softer Governor Malloy. Christine told us to stay home and bake brownies. And a lot of people did. I was getting tweets all day long.
On Pi Day, yeah. On Pi Day, he asked us to stay home and bake brownies. So the governor baked brownies. Well, his wife baked brownies yesterday, and he shared them with the press corps.
There's actually a class action suit now about whether the governor can force us to bake brownies or not.
And he also broke out a brand new ensemble, Denim on Denim, Colin. I like that for the emergency response. Usually the governor wears a jacket with his name on it or a hat that looks like an emergency response hat. Yesterday, a little something different, sartorially.
Right, and there is like this whole kind of iconography to this. There's sort of a kabuki to like. I always feel as though I wasn't really watching television yesterday, so I don't know whether this is apropos or not. But in general, and certainly back in 2011, I always feel like it's a mistake to watch the governor. Watch Nancy Wyman's face, because it'll tell you exactly how serious things are.
How scared to be.
Yeah, how scared you should, how really frightened you should be. So don't look at the governor, all right? He's got a script, he's got stuff he can say. Nancy Wyman's face, that's the real barometer.
Of course, most of the state is now either dug out or digging out. There are a lot of school districts across the state that are closed or on long delays today, but things will get back to normal. What I want to focus on next, though, is a series that has come out in the last week in the Hartford Courant. Matt Coffin has worked with Vanessa De La Torre and others at the Hartford Courant on a big 20-year retrospective of Sheff versus O'Neill. One of the things that we understood about Sheff versus O'Neill when it was first raised was it was going to help to integrate Hartford schools. Now, there have been questions about whether or not that style of integration has helped, whether or not it's meant better performance for Hartford school students. There's an awful lot to say about 20 years after Sheff, but the thing that I take away after the series, Matt, is that Hartford public schools aren't really any less segregated than they were when this whole thing started.
Well, Hartford neighborhood schools, right, are not, and most Hartford children are still in Hartford neighborhood schools that, again, 20 years ago, the Connecticut Supreme Court said violated their constitutional rights. Certainly, magnet schools have provided great opportunities for thousands of students, but again, we are 20 years past a point at which children were told you are in an illegal situation, and that illegality persists for most Hartford students. So Vanessa had a very deeply reported story inside Milner School of sort of exactly what it is like on the ground and how the concentration of poverty, the concentration of need that was identified a generation ago in the Sheff suit remains for most Hartford children. And then beyond that, we also learned something in the second day of the series about sort of how the lottery operates in a way that makes many people really uncomfortable, that literally there are waiting lists and principals are forced in order to try to meet integration standards. They are literally looking name by name, individual by individual, at the next people on the wait list. And if those wait lists are too front-loaded with Black and Latino children, they will leave those seats empty and relegate those students back to neighborhood schools.
There's a lot of multimedia in the Hartford Courant website, including some interviews. This is Martha Stone, lead attorney for the plaintiffs in Sheff.
You have 45% of the families participating in magnets. You have almost half, let's just say, for purposes of this discussion. So it's not like the Hartford community doesn't like Sheff, right? It's a segment of the Hartford community that is frustrated with Sheff. Some of it is because their neighborhood schools haven't been improved at all, and some of it is because they keep applying and they don't get in. And that's because the state has put these caps on and has not allowed the growth.
So let's explain this a little further, Matt. So there is the quality of the neighborhood schools and the fact that most Hartford school kids are still at these neighborhood schools and not in these magnet schools. But you mentioned a lottery to get into magnets. How exactly does this work? Because whenever you think about a lottery, you think about people who win, but like any lottery, a lot more people lose.
Yeah, so the lottery is designed, and about 19,000 students from Hartford and surrounding communities enter the lottery. There are magnet schools. There's the open choice program, an outbound busing program that sends Hartford students to suburban schools. And there are only so many spaces, and there are only so many spaces that the state will fund, which is less than the capacity in the magnet schools. And so I think a lot of people assumed it was a generally, and it's been described by the state as a random lottery. Your number comes up. If you're a low enough number, you get into the school that you want. In fact, the lottery is sort of very carefully engineered. There are different preferences that they put in. A town that is generally white demographic will have a higher preference than towns that do not. And again, a number of other ways that essentially whites and Asians are kind of pushed to the front of the lottery to try to increase the numbers to make schools sufficiently integrated to count under the Sheff standard. You need 25% of the students white or Asian. If there are not spaces, you end up on a wait list. You end up back in a neighborhood school if those seats are not filled. And so, Martha talks sort of a lot about we have made great progress. The state has failed to. Our series was not about blame. One of the things I learned in doing this project. I talked to a lot of the chef people and would say, but you won the case. Why is it that you are still having to fight so hard to get what it is that you want? And I've realized that civil rights battles are both legal battles and political battles, that the fight is not over when the legal battle is won. And so there's a political jockeying, there's a certain defensiveness over this, but sort of the bottom line remains, 20 years after the chef suit, most students are still left behind. If this were, I know education is much more complicated. If we were 20 years after the Voting Rights Act and half of Hartford African American and Latinos were allowed to vote, this would be intolerable. And so we thought it was important for all the good that the chef decision has done to give a voice to those that have been left behind in this process.
Colin, your reaction to some of this, because we've been following Chef for so many years now, and its inability to solve some of the intractable problems that frankly don't just plague Hartford Public Schools, but plague many urban schools across America.
Right. Well, there are some differences here. First of all, this is great journalism, and people want to know, what is journalism for? Journalism is for stuff like this, and it's just an amazing series, an important series. It's both sort of outraging at the level of policy, and it's outraging at a much more deep-seated moral level. And I hope we can talk about that latter aspect. So yeah, it's a hard thing to understand, and Matt just did a great job explaining it. But maybe one thing to sort of stress is, first of all, yes, Hartford's solutions are very much a creation of a court process, really kind of two landmark suits if you really get down to it, because it started out with Horton versus Meskel, which was sort of more about funding equalization. And then they did funding equalization and nothing changed, which was one of the reasons Jeff versus O'Neill came along saying, no, it's still a problem. You can throw money at this problem and you really don't change it all that much. Using magnet schools as a solution, one of the reasons to do magnet schools, obviously, was nobody wanted to do forced busing of suburban kids into the city. That was just too big a stick of dynamite. One of the things that you have to do, and the series really spelled this out well, you have to sort of bait these schools, in order to lure suburban parents. And the bait has to come from Zabar's too, So these magnet schools in the city, they have to be really fabulous. They have to be really fabulous, not as some kind of act of extravagance, but in order to hit these numerical targets of getting people in from the suburbs. And just the one thing that I would say is we are, in many respects, fortunate that Connecticut has an educational provision within its constitution, which therefore creates the room for these kinds of lawsuits. The problem is, and it's so well spelled out in this series, you have ultimately an educational system that's a creation of lawsuits and is very edgy about lawsuits. So, in some of this, there's some things where you look at it and say, well, common sense just dictates that you rejigger the formula this way, or you do this, or you do that, because these empty seats are a screaming eyesore, so let's get students into those seats. But everybody's kind of got a little bit of happy feet about the next lawsuit. And everybody's sort of very aware that this system is a creation of lawsuits. And if they mess with formulas too much or just do a common sense thing that defies one of the legal remedies, they're going to be marching into more trouble. And they're probably a little bit more skittish than a different kind of system would be under these circumstances.
So I actually covered education and the Hartford school system back when I worked for the Hartford Advocate back in 2000. And at that time, we had Superintendent Anthony Amato, and his proposal was to take all of the neighborhood schools in Hartford and turn them into some sort of fabulous magnet to attract the suburban students to those schools. So I don't know what iterations have gone on since that tenure. It obviously hasn't worked, but I think that part of Matt's piece was kind of interesting in that charter schools, different from magnets. Charter schools integration is not one of their goals or one of their mandates, and maybe simple policy changes such as that could help move this along. I don't know.
Well, it's interesting that if you're saying by a policy change, you're saying maybe we're in a post-integration phase here. There certainly is. Charter schools are at the center of this evolving thought over urban education. And sort of interestingly, many decades after Brown versus Board of Ed, there is this thought out there of, well, maybe integration isn't the most important thing. And it's really interesting to sort of see that debate evolving. And it's most evident in charter schools. We have charter schools that are 99.9% Black and Latino. And the state isn't making an issue of it. The parents who attend those schools don't appear to be making an issue of it, and certainly the operators are not.
I want to get to one quick phone call here. Peter's calling from Stanford. Hi, Peter. Go ahead.
Yes, I think this issue might have been brought up many times over the course of not this show, but the program, that Connecticut's a very small state geographically, and we don't have a county-wide system. So all the towns and the cities, Hartford is primarily, Black and Latino, and West Hartford or Simsbury might be more white. So if we could make it a county or regional-wide system, or maybe something akin to the congressional districts, then we would be able to make the school systems a little more. You can integrate, you can export and import different populations, or just cooperation between the towns. Because I know that Hartford, West Hartford, East Hartford, they're all clustered, but they're very small geographically. If you could broaden that, you could have more. Because I don't think the towns and cities cooperate. It's just only in Hartford where there's busing, but across the river is a totally different district, and this is statewide.
And actually, Peter, thank you very much for raising that. It's one of the things that we have talked about over the years, and it's one of the core issues at the heart of not only the problems around education in Connecticut, but around a lot of other funding and taxing issues. Matt, do you want to jump in on what Peter says? And I'd like to get Colin's take on this as well, because obviously Chef was not saying we're going to move toward fully regional school systems, but we would look a lot different as an education system if we had something that looked like that.
Let me tell you, if we all gather again for the Wheelhouse 10 million years from now, there will not be regional school districts in Connecticut. We could not abide county government in this state. We are an extremely parochial state. I mean, this is interesting. When I first got a call, I was out in Wisconsin, and an editor from the Current called and sort of said, would you be interested in coming back to the East Coast? I knew very little about Connecticut, and I happened to go down to the public library in Wausau, Wisconsin, and grabbed a map of Connecticut. And it happened to be not so much a road map, but a town map, a town and city map, and it showed the geographical boundaries. And I looked at it and I thought, well, that's weird. The cities are no larger, and in some cases smaller geographically, than the suburban towns around it. And I did not realize then that I knew everything I needed to know about Connecticut. This is a system that does not work. I've spent a lot of time when I travel, and I've blathered on this to a lot of people, that one summer I'd gone to the Bay Area, I'd gone to Austin, and I just wondered, why is it that something like Austin works, and I mean, San Francisco's huge, but other places seem to work in a way that Hartford struggles. And I think a great deal of it has to do with that geographic isolation. If we were, if my home in West Hartford were simply the West Hartford section of Hartford, then when something's going on in Bushnell Park, I'm not sure my neighbors would say, whoa, that's got nothing to do with me. So regionalism is most, progressives anyway, think it's a great idea. And in Connecticut, I think it is utterly doomed.
Yeah, I mean, Peter's absolutely right. But because he's right, it'll never happen. What I mean by that is he's right that what's happened is you have this tiny little 16 square mile diorama of urban poverty. The reason we're not going to have regionalism is because that would involve the towns having to absorb a tremendous amount of urban poverty, which they don't want to do. In other words, Hartford, we're having a big debate in America about healthcare too. There's sort of an analogy here. Hartford's like a health insurance company where all the clients are incredibly sick. So that insurance company goes under because they don't have any healthy people to absorb the cost of the sick people. And really, regionalism would be like that. In other words, if you had, cities typically aren't 16 square miles. They're much bigger. They would encompass the equivalents of West Hartford, East Hartford, Windsor, Wethersfield, Newington. If you had that, then you would have, quote unquote, healthy schools, healthy education systems, healthy tax bases, absorbing a lot of the pain and sickness of this very condensed urban population, and the suburban people don't want to do that. That's exactly why they don't want urban regional government. They don't want to take care of people in the cities.
Is there a level of racism to that? I mean, is there, why is it? It was in Matt's story yesterday. Why is it that Glastonbury parent doesn't want to open up more seats in Glastonbury for the Hartford students? And is telling the people in Hartford, well, come buy a house in Glastonbury and invest in the schools, and then you can go to our schools.
Well, it was worded more snarkily than that.
It was, yes.
I mean, it was something to the effect of, if these people want these kinds of schools, they can work hard and buy a house in Glastonbury. So that's just the solution. Obviously, if you're currently making, minimum wage in Hartford and barely holding your life together, work a little harder and you can buy a house in Glastonbury. And that attitude is a lot of what we're talking about here.
Well, and I will just say, when I first moved to Connecticut, I came from living in Boston, but growing up in Pittsburgh, I heard people actually use the term that Colin just used an awful lot. These people, those people, and that's an awful lot of what suburban folks talk about when they talk about some of the cities. Quickly, let's go to Norma in West Hartford. Hi, Norma. Go ahead quickly.
I am a founder of 2 interdistrict magnet schools in Hartford that have reached national recognition, and was the principal of one for 15 years. Just retired a couple of years ago, and I'm now doing consulting. But I just want to point out several things. I heard the gentleman a few minutes ago use, are we in a post-integration phase? And I'm not sure what that would be. He was questioning whether separate is not equal, as established by Brown versus Board of Education back in 1954, that maybe we're now in a post-integration phase. As the person who worked for 20 years in Hartford schools, in those Milner-type schools, I founded a magnet school back in 1998. We started as a charter and then became one of the first 2 magnets, and in 2002. And, we watched the transformation that the additional monies, the integration of racial and economically made in what was possible. And we are not in a post-integration phase. Obviously, if you look at what's going on nationally in this country, what we need is exactly what's going on in our magnet schools. We are a national model that's being acknowledged by Stanford University researchers, by people who are coming from all over the nation.
Hey, so Norma, and I just want to ask quickly, because we need to go and get to a break there, because I'd love to have Matt chime in for a second. But what about what continues to happen at, say, Milner School? What about the schools that aren't benefiting from some of the changes that you've been able to institute, the students who've been able to take advantage of those opportunities? What about the kids at the neighborhood schools who don't have some of the same opportunities?
Well, there are 2 things that could be done. The state needs to take responsibility for addressing the fact that the Sheff lawsuit said they were in violation of equal educational opportunity. If they're taking responsibility, and 20 years down the road, we haven't gotten there to quality integrated education for all, it's the state's fault, not Sheff. And unfortunately, the way it's being promoted and written about, it's as if the Sheff lawsuit caused these problems. The Sheff lawsuit moved us from 100% of students being in poor, not quality integrated education to, 47% of our students being there. If we do a line graph, we need to keep going until we're at 100%. Not criticize the 53% still aren't there.
Norma,
we did the idea of charter schools, as one of your guests said before, charter schools being required to follow the same standards as magnets in terms of, meeting integration standards. That would be one additional thing, creating more seats in suburban towns. offering better incentives for them to do that.
And Norma, we've talked about some of those things, and I'm going to go to Matt quickly because we're up against the break. Thank you so much for your call.
Sure. So Norma's talking about the Breakthrough magnet schools, which are terrific schools. Vanessa and I spent time with the current principal of Breakthrough Magnet, great educator, great school. There is, and again, I don't think anything in our series suggests that we're assigning fault here. I think there is a question, certainly, of the state's commitment, given the high price tag. We spent $3 billion so far. But in addition to that, it's possible that we have sort of reached the capacity of white suburbanites interested in attending magnet schools. What Norma talks about, sort of this line chart to continue to get to 100%. If we're talking about doubling the number of magnet schools, that would require then doubling the number of white suburbanites interested in attending those magnet schools, particularly those located in Hartford. I just don't think those numbers are there.
I think also, one thing the series does is sketch out this incredible bottleneck. And the bottleneck is causing seats at very desirable magnet schools to go begging, right? There's nobody in them because of this formula. So, with all due respect for Norma to say, well, we're making progress and we'll continue to make progress. Well, not until that problem gets solved. That's outrageous. And it is a product. Nobody's blaming Chef. Chef did a lot, but there's sort of a post-Chef shift that has to go on, and we have to figure out what that is.
We got to take a break. When we come back, we're going to move on to the state capitol, maybe some new tax proposals, sugary beverages, carbon, other things. We're talking with Colin McEnroe, host of the Colin McEnroe Show on WNPR. Matt Kaufman from the Hartford Courant and Christine Stewart from CTNewsJunkie.com. This is The Wheelhouse. This is The Wheelhouse. I'm John Dankosky. We're talking today with Christine Stewart, the editor of CTNewsJunkie.com. Matt Kaufman, investigative reporter with the Hartford Courant. Colin McEnroe, host of the Colin McEnroe Show on WNPR. Hey, Colin, what's on your show today?
Well, Russia's very much in the news today, so we decided to talk a little bit about how Russia got to be in the state that it is right now. This kind of, this rogue nation in a way. So we'll be having people from Russia and people who have lived in Russia tell us a little bit about life under Putin.
Very nice. So Russia this afternoon on the Colin McEnroe Show at 1 o'clock. We were talking in the first segment of the program about this really important series that Matt Kaufman and his colleagues at the Hartford Courant did about Chef versus O'Neill, 20 years in, and integration or not in the Hartford Public Schools. Quickly, before we go to some other stuff at the Capitol, what's happening with funding around education in the budget this year, Christine? Obviously, there's an awful lot of concern about how much cities and towns are going to be getting in this very lean budget time. What are they talking about at the state capitol right now?
Oh, there are lawsuits being proposed regarding. So I guess the most controversial part of this whole thing is that the governor wants to put a third of the teachers' pension cost onto cities and towns. And by doing that, towns even or cities even like Bridgeport, which you're trying to help increase education funding for, would actually lose $8.3 million under the governor's budget proposal. So that's really kind of throwing a wedge into debating or being able to debate any sort of education funding formula.
And Matt, very quickly, when it comes to the state's responsibility, as Norma was talking about funding education, whether it's in Hartford or Bridgeport or any place else, how much does that play in? As you took a close look at this, how much of the problem or how many of the solutions might come from how the state actually decides it's going to fund education moving forward?
Right. Well, with the CJEF suit, sort of the whole concept of how education is funded is kind of up in the air right now. Education is fantastically expensive at the local level and also at the state level, and the state is in a budget pinch. And we have seen, the state, even with the Chef suit, has sort of, put out some little suggestions that maybe we've made enough progress and we can, stop court oversight. And I think that has less to do with a lack of commitment to integration and quality schools than it does just fear over the cost.
Colin?
I don't have an intelligent gloss to put on what they said. I'll say something very different, which is that last week the Radcliffe Institute had this symposium on slavery and the complicity of big Northeastern universities in slavery, and the keynote speaker was Ta-Nehisi Coates, talking as usual about how slavery wasn't a bump of the road, it was the road, and then of course calling for reparations. I actually do think one way that big, rich, heavy endowment Northeast universities could address this is by adopting some of these schools on a foundation basis. Milner's probably not a good target because it might get closed, but pick a school that's not going to be closed in the next 5 to 10 years in one of the urban pockets in your state. If you're, say, Yale, and you have a gigantic endowment, and say, yes, in recognition of the fact that some of Yale's wealth was built on slavery, we're going to take a look at some of these schools that are populated 99% by people of color and figure out what we can do for them in terms of upgrading the plant and upgrading the program.
They've started some of that. The New Haven Promise over the course of the last several years has put an awful lot of kids into schools that they wouldn't have normally gotten into. That said, I think Yale has a lot more money that they've made over the years that they might be able to put into that, but at least it has been a start. Let's move on to some other things that are happening at the state capitol. And Christine, you've been writing about proposals for taxes. Of course, whenever there's a budget shortfall, taxes come up. But some of the taxes that you've been writing about, plastic bags, carbon, sugary beverages, don't seem to be necessarily moneymakers as much as social change agents in some way.
Yeah, I guess they're disguised as such, but I guess it makes it all the more palpable to talk about when you're running a $1.7 billion deficit.
Sure, yeah. Well, why not another tax?
So I think that, the sugary beverage tax, that's $85 million a year that would bring in revenue. I forget what legalization of marijuana would bring in, but that's another healthy sum of money. And the carbon tax. That would actually not bring in as much money because that tax would then be redistributed to people who actually conserve their
explain what the carbon tax is that is being proposed exactly.
So it's something like 15 I forget exactly what the amount is, but it's a tax being proposed on businesses and residents who, exude carbon or who use fossil fuels in a way, and then that tax would be redistributed, and then based on some sort of average you would get a rebate if you if you conserve your energy.
Just $15
your
a ton.
emissions.
$15 a ton on carbon pollution. On petroleum products such as coal, oil, natural gas, propane, or any other petroleum products.
So basically those fossil fuels which businesses and individuals purchase there would be an increased cost to those.
I didn't know that. I looked that up while she was talking.
Yeah.
I think it sounds like I'm super knowledgeable.
I cleared my driveway and sidewalk without the use of a snowblower, so I'm expecting like $1,000 back from the state at this point.
This is the first time they're actually talking about this. In other states in the area, Massachusetts has a bill, Rhode Island has a bill, Vermont has a bill, New Hampshire is thinking about studying the issue. They don't actually have a bill, but...
Well, and these are all states that are already have been engaged in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. They've been looking for years at ways in which they can partner together to try to lessen the carbon footprint of this region. Is this something that actually has some sort of a chance of happening at the state capitol?
I wouldn't say that it has a chance of happening this year, but maybe in 5 years. This is something that we're looking at.
And a plastic bag tax, this is something that other states and municipalities have taken on, 5 cents for single-use plastic bags to use the money to help maintain state parks. Well, that sounds awful nice.
Yeah. So this is actually an interesting proposal because this has Republican support. So Senator Craig Minor, who is a Republican from Litchfield, was like, I know this is a tax, and I'm okay with this tax because it's going to go to help fund state parks. And then you have a Democrat like Mary Mashinsky from Wallingford who's like, yeah, but every time we put money into a special fund, somehow it gets swept up to pay for, she's like, every special fund, since I've been here has somehow been raided.
But and just to be clear again, they're the ones who raid it, right? It's not like It's not like somebody else comes in the dark of night, breaks in and takes the money. They're actually the ones who raid it. So could they potentially write some sort of a law that says the money would go to the state parks and we, wouldn't take it out to do anything else with.
They could. They've been trying to do that kind of stuff for years, but there's always a loophole. There's always a catch. I mean, we can't even get a lockbox on our gas funds and our transportation.
Yeah, instead of a lockbox, it's actually much more like a plastic bag, Colin. It's just really anybody can break in.
It isn't Representative Jekyll who does this. It's Mr. Hyde who comes out and takes the money out of the dedicated fund, tie him to the table at night so he can't do these things. So, first of all, I mean, a lot of these things are sort of things that they should probably just do and not disguise them as revenue streams. In fact, banning plastic bags, I was just in Vieques, which is not a place I would have guessed would ever do anything like this. And Vieques banned plastic bags, and it really works great, and they're not all over the roadsides. And you go to the grocery store and you get your stuff in a box. I think Christine shops at Aldi where they don't have any plastic bags. I mean, we actually can do without plastic bags. It really would work just fine. And so it's, whether or not it makes sense to disguise it as a revenue source as opposed to a policy issue probably has a little bit more to do with the anthropology of the General Assembly. Can they talk about something? I don't know. There's this state legislator in Texas who, kind of as a joke, as a satirical thing, has proposed a fine for masturbation, which, obviously if we did that in Connecticut, even if it was $1, we could probably balance the budget if people took it seriously. But, I mean, I don't know. Does everything have to have a revenue stream attached to it just for us to do the right thing?
Well, I just have to remind you that we have cat licensing this year,
right,
up as one of the proposals. So,
And
you know what? Long Beach, California, and there's actually, I forget which city in Texas. There is a city in Texas that does this. I think it would be better done at the municipal level, like a dog license.
How much are they going to charge for the cat license?
Like $8, like they charge for the dog.
I'm going to have to get rid of one of my cats. Matt?
I can tell you, I go to Rwanda twice a year, and as you are approaching Kigali Airport, the pilot comes on and says plastic bags are not permitted in the country, and literally leave them, in the seat pocket. So if Rwanda can get by without plastic bags, I think Connecticut's probably advanced enough.
Hopefully somebody's listening today can actually use that line at the state capitol in a debate.
Right. That's really going to sway the Republicans on that.
But I think Christine is absolutely right that taxes are basically used either to, promote or deter certain activities or simply to raise money. And I think we are seeing very much the combination of that it's awfully convenient. And when you raise money, it's good to spread out your taxes because, if you did everything in a sales tax, people wouldn't buy as much. If you did everything in an income tax, that would be a disincentive to, work extra hours and the like. So you want to spread things out so that it doesn't, impact any items you're not trying to impact. But I think it's entirely just a happy coincidence that our newfound concern for state parks will bring in, X million dollars.
Right,
so.
exactly. And apparently, state parks are in total disrepair at the moment. So
this is what I suppose. I don't know.
Apparently, you have to clean up before you even have a gathering there because the trash cans are just overflowing.
And the lockbox idea, I mean, even if there were a lockbox, who holds the key to the lockbox? I mean, it just, unless you're going to pass a constitutional amendment, it's just another bill to unlock the box. So.
Mary Riley, the loyal maid. That's the way it works in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Anyway.
Okay, she holds the key.
She's got the key.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's talk about something else. We've been waiting for a legal opinion from Connecticut Attorney General George Jepsen this week. He says that there's legal and financial risk to granting Connecticut's two federally recognized tribes exclusivity to open up a third casino. This comes amidst a, I don't know, Colin, how else to say it, but a barrage of advertising coming from the folks at MGM. It's showing up in my social media. It's all over the place saying that it's unfair that the state has gotten into bed with these two tribal casinos and they should open it up to a much more fair process. Then George Jepsen comes out with his legal opinion and he basically says, it could be a little bit of a problem for us if it gets into court.
I don't think you're really giving George enough credit for his eloquence. What he said was there was a not insubstantial risk. By the way, in the original draft, Martin Luther King said, "I have a not insubstantial dream." I feel like we're given this really, I don't know, I'm probably being really stupid about this, but I feel like we're being given this really false choice, What do you want? Do you want this sort of joint tribe East Windsor casino or a competitive process where other people can try to have casinos in other places and they're not necessarily Indian tribes? How about no more casinos? Where's that choice? Why is that choice not one of the choices?
Well, because then it would have to be 10 cents per plastic bag if we don't get that additional revenue.
Christine, you know more about this probably than anybody, and know that the committee is voting today because they're not usually allowed to vote on Wednesdays, but it was snowing yesterday. So, I mean, they're voting on both of these ideas, right?
They are voting on both of these ideas. I'm expecting that both of them will get out of committee this year. And then they'll have a greater debate in the House and the Senate on these.
So is there concern at the Capitol? And again, I don't think we had to wait for the not insubstantial ruling from Attorney General Jepsen. Just to be fair, in the way he wrote this, he does say, I'm going to have to defend the state no matter what. So he can only go out on a limb so far whenever he's writing an opinion about whether or not this is a good idea or not. That all being said, what are people thinking about at the state Capitol as they consider whether or not we're going to build another casino to try to stave off people from going up to Springfield?
So I feel like lawmakers, I think especially Representative Dan Rivero's kind of like, exemplified this. He kind of feels like he's being spun in so many directions that he can't come up with his he can't figure out what is best for the state at this point. So, financially, if you look at it, opening up the tribal compact, if you allow the two tribes to go forward with this exclusively, could risk the $260 million we get in slot revenue per year. And how many years would it take to then build a commercial casino? If we decided to build one, and would we build it in Bridgeport instead of in East Windsor, if that was the case? And there's just so many different scenarios that lawmakers, they're really struggling with this.
But not, as Colin said before, the scenario of no new casinos at all, or is there? I mean, are people saying, maybe let's just cool off on this, just make sure we don't have any more casinos in the state? It's more trouble than it's worth right now.
I don't feel like they believe that that's an option.
But it is.
But it is.
Because of Springfield.
Right, because of Springfield. Because we have this competitor up north, and they say that they will lose jobs and further jobs. And, I just have to say about the 2006 job numbers, the reason that, Connecticut had no new job growth in 2016 was because the government sector lost jobs, not because the private sector lost jobs.
Okay, we got to take a break. And when we come back, we're going to talk about a few things, including, I think Rachel Maddow finally told us what was in Donald Trump's tax returns. And we're also going to talk about brand new parking meters in Bridgeport that people are really, really upset about. We're talking in the wheelhouse about the week's news here on WNPR. This is The Wheelhouse. I'm John Dankosky. We're talking about the week's news with Christine Stewart from CTNewsJunkie.com, Matt Kaufman of the Hartford Courant, and our own Colin McEnroe. A lot to get to in just the last couple moments of our show today. The House and Senate in the state reconfirmed Supreme Court Justice Richard Palmer last Wednesday after a long and difficult renomination hearing. And it's usually not like this, Colin. What's so interesting about this particular story? Because it's usually a pretty easy thing. This wasn't easy.
That's what's interesting about it. I mean, in other words, so Dick Palmer, I think, is arguably the intellectual leader of the Supreme Court right now. The opinions that he's associated with are important majority opinions. He wrote the gay marriage opinion. He wrote one of the really significant death penalty opinions recently. He's the kind of justice who ordinarily would just go on the consent calendar or the effective consent calendar. There, in the past, there aren't political fights about somebody's ideology. I mean, I don't know. I haven't covered every single Supreme Court reconfirmation in the last 20 years. I just don't remember such a close and basically partisan vote. And it seems as though that's one of the ways Len Fasano, the minority leader who has this new set of numbers that are pretty competitive numbers, he's flexing his muscle a little bit here. But I think this is a bad area to go into. I mean, Dick Palmer should not be controversial. He's he really represents kind of the mainstream thinking of the court. There have been some fairly, heated arguments on the court in the last few years. But, why this is a close vote, I think it has much more to do with what's going on in the Senate than what's going on in the state Supreme Court.
There are a lot of quotes, Christine, about activist judges. This is something that we hear an awful lot about at the federal level, but this cropped up in this hearing as well.
They did. They asked him during the confirmation hearing whether they felt that, or whether he respected the legislature as a co-equal branch of government, and of course his answer was yes, he does.
Good answer.
But they felt that the judiciary was encroaching on their branch of government.
Well, of course, activist judging is always in the eye of the beholder, is sort of my first thought. There was also in the legislature a sort of, to me, a surprising amount of concern over some very, very sharp language in opinions. Justice Palmer and Justice Espinoza, who may get along great when they're not writing opinions, have really, really had the daggers out on a couple of recent decisions. And that seemed to bother the legislature in a sort of court decorum kind of way. I'm a transparency guy, so I say, I want them to include everything they're feeling.
In a lot of downtowns, merchants have been clamoring for newfangled parking meters. You don't have to, put in all those stacks of quarters and go out and check your car all the time. You can just put in a credit card. A lot of cities and towns around the state have gone to these. Bridgeport has brand new parking meters, but actually now the merchants aren't so thrilled.
Well, so Bridgeports are a little bit different than the ones that you're used to. And they're certainly a lot different from what people in Bridgeport are used to. So what these meters do actually is they sense your car. They sense that your car is there. And if you don't give them any money after 5 minutes, then the meter starts running, so to speak, and then you get a ticket in the mail, and you never interact with a human being. So, and it sort of brings up all the anthropology of parking meters, which is, first of all, there are people who feel like if they're in their car at the parking meter, they're not really parked. Well, of course, this little machine doesn't know that. The little robo-meter doesn't know that. So
it doesn't have a heat sensor. It can't tell that there's a living, breathing human in there just smoking a cigarette or answering a text.
It's not a microwave.
Right. Yeah. So there was a retired judge who's very upset because she dropped her father off at the barber shop and then sat there in the car waiting for him to come out, unaware of the fact that the meter was noticing that her car was there. And it's certainly, then you think about a city like Bridgeport, where there probably are some people who never get parking tickets because the meter maids know whose car that is. Yeah. Well, I mean, this machine, it's not a meter maid. It doesn't know who your car is. It doesn't know you're some kind of big shot. So you're going to get a parking ticket. And so people are not happy about that.
Well, worse than that, the parking meters cost Bridgeport nothing because the company that put them in cut a deal that said, look, we'll put these in for free, but we get a portion not just of the parking meter revenue, but the ticket revenue. And this is just never a good idea. And I really feel like it's classic preying on struggling cities.
What could possibly go wrong, right? We'll just take a little bit of the revenue.
This Kaufman human is insolent. He does not respect us. Issue him a ticket immediately.
Yeah. I mean, society sort of assigns different importances to different crimes. We jaywalk, with abandon, and probably wouldn't with a cop standing right next to us unless the cop started walking across first. Parking meters are one of those things where, we've kind of decided, we've gotten in the habit anyway of maybe we'll risk it. We'll see how it goes. And this turns that on its head. And this was done without any sort of information going out to residents. So I understand the anger about it.
And I think the thing that residents are upset about, Christine, is that now, shop owners are saying people are scared to park downtown. They don't want a ticket. And what you need is actually people parking in downtown Bridgeport, going to stores and stuff.
Right. Yeah, no, this is not a good thing. And I think that we see more often, probably, I see it in Hartford all the time where you've got one person in the car waiting and, even outside the courthouse, the marshals park and they park outside the courthouse.
Don't get started with the marshals.
I know.
Don't get Jeff going started about the marshals. It's a whole, these meters don't know that you're a marshal.
Why is it, just put the money in the meter? That's what you do. It's a parking meter.
Look,
why is that a big problem?
It's 56 minutes past the hour, which is about the time during the 9 o'clock hour yesterday that Rachel Maddow finally got to the news that she had about Trump's tax returns. Colin, we just have a minute or so left. Did you stay up to watch Rachel Maddow's big reveal of Donald Trump's 2005 tax returns?
I did not, and I never entertained the thought of doing it. At a time when journalism is being challenged by the president constantly as an enemy of the people, I think journalists ought to be on their best behavior. And I'm not sure last night represented the best behavior journalism can achieve.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I stayed up only because I knew it might come up on this show, and I didn't want to look stupid. I didn't see a whole lot of there. I thought the White House actually reacted poorly to it and making a big issue of, he has a fiduciary responsibility to pay as little as that. I would have said he paid $38 million. That's more than, an average, 9,000 people, whatever, and left it at that. But I'm hoping we see, frankly, more tax returns. The fact that he doesn't want to reveal them suggests to me there's probably something somewhere in there.
But when we saw, a couple hours earlier, an hour and a half earlier, Christine, that we were going to get this big reveal, and then it turns out to be not all that much. It's not necessarily great for journalism, and it's also not all that terribly interesting. Donald Trump paid some taxes. He maybe didn't pay as much as others would pay in America. That's not something that anybody thought was any different, right?
This is where TV journalists drive print journalists absolutely crazy because, they are responsible and, there are ratings to consider.
There are always ratings to consider. Christine Stewart, editor of CTNewsJunkie.com. Thanks so much, Christine. I appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thanks to Matt Kaufman, investigative reporter for the Hartford Courant. Thanks, Matt, for being here, and also thanks for your great series. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
And thanks to Colin McEnroe, host of the Colin McEnroe Show. Thanks, Colin.
I did not pay $38 million in taxes in 2005.
Our program produced by Katie Tolarski with Kyone Wolf, and thanks to Betsy Kaplan today. This is The Wheelhouse.